This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, April 2007. Summer by Edith Wharton. Chapter 11. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the freckled boy from Creston stopped his sleepy horse at the door of the Red House, and Charity got out. Harney had taken leave of her at Creston River, charging the boy to drive her home. Her mind was still in a fog of misery, and she did not remember very clearly what had happened, or what they had said to each other during the interminable interval since their departure from Nettleton. But the secretive instinct of the animal in pain was so strong in her that she had a sense of relief when Harney got out and she drove on alone. The full moon hung over North Dormer, whitening the mist that filled the hollows between the hills and floated transparently above the fields. Charity stood a moment at the gate, looking out into the waning night. She watched the boy drive off, his horse's head wagging heavily to and fro. Then she went around to the kitchen door and felt under the mat for the key. She found it, unlocked the door, and went in. The kitchen was dark, but she discovered a box of matches, lit a candle, and went upstairs. Mr. Royal's door, opposite hers, stood open on his unlit room. Evidently he had not come back. She went into her room, bolted her door, and began slowly to untie the ribbon about her waist, and to take off her dress. Under the bed she saw the paper bag in which she had hidden her new hat from inquisitive eyes. She lay for a long time sleepless on her bed, staring up at the moonlight on the low ceiling. Dawn was in the sky when she fell asleep, and when she woke, the sun on her face. She dressed and went down to the kitchen. Verena was there alone. She glanced at Charity tranquilly, with her old, deaf-looking eyes. There was no sign of Mr. Royal about the house, and the hours passed without his reappearing. Charity had gone up to her room, and sat there listlessly. Puffs of sultry air fanned her dimity window curtains, and flies buzzed stiflingly against the bluish panes. At 1 o'clock, Verena hobbled up to see if she were not coming down to dinner, but she shook her head, and the old woman went away saying, "I'll cover up, then." The sun turned and left her room, and Charity seated herself in the window, gazing down the village street through the half-opened shutters. Not a thought was in her mind. It was just a dark whirlpool of crowding images, and she watched the people passing along the street. Dan Targett's team hauling a load of pine trunks down to Hepburn, the sexton's old white horse grazing on the bank across the way, as if she looked at these familiar sights from the other side of the grave. She was roused from her apathy by seeing Ally Hawes come out of the Fry's gate and walk slowly toward the Red House with her uneven limping step. At the sight, Charity recovered her severed contact with reality. She divined that Ally was coming to hear about her day. No one else was in the secret of the trip to Nettleton, and it flattered Ally profoundly to be allowed to know of it. At the thought of having to see her, of having to meet her eyes and answer or evade her questions, the whole horror of the previous night's adventure rushed back upon Charity. What had been a feverish nightmare became a cold and unescapable fact. Poor Ally at that moment represented North Dormer, with all its mean curiosities, its furtive malice, its sham unconsciousness of evil. Charity knew that although all relations with Julia were supposed to be severed, the tender-hearted Ally still secretly communicated with her, and no doubt Julia would exult in the chance of retailing the scandal of the wharf. The story, exaggerated and distorted, was probably already on its way to North Dormer. Ally's dragging pace had not carried her far from the Fry's gate when she was stopped by old Mrs. Solus, who was a great talker, and spoke very slowly because she had never been able to get used to her new teeth from Hepburn. Still, even this respite would not last long. In another 10 minutes, Ally would be at the door, and Charity would hear her greeting Verena in the kitchen, and then calling up from the foot of the stairs. Suddenly it became clear that flight, and instant flight, was the only thing conceivable. The longing to escape, to get away from familiar faces, from places where she was known, had always been strong in her, in moments of distress. She had a childish belief in the miraculous power of strange scenes and new faces to transform her life and wipe out bitter memories. But such impulses were mere fleeting whims compared to the cold resolve which now possessed her. She felt she could not remain an hour longer under the roof of the man who had publicly dishonoured her, and face to face with the people who would presently be gloating over all the details of her humiliation. Her passing pity for Mr. Royal had been swallowed up in loathing. Everything in her recoiled from the disgraceful spectacle of the drunken old man apostrophizing her in the presence of a band of loafers and street-walkers. Suddenly, vividly, she relived again the horrible moment when he had tried to force himself into her room, and what she had before supposed to be a mad aberration now appeared to her as a vulgar incident into a debauched and degraded life. While these thoughts were hurrying through her, she had dragged out her old canvas school-bag, and was thrusting into it a few articles of clothing and the little packet of letters she had received from Harney. From under her pincushion she took the library key and laid it in full view. Then she felt at the back of a drawer for the blue brooch that Harney had given her. She would not have dared to wear it openly at North Dormer, but now she fastened it on her bosom as if it were a talisman to protect her in flight. These preparations had taken but a few minutes, and when they were finished, Ally Hawes was still at the Fry's corner, talking to old Mrs. Sollis. She had said to herself, as she always said in moments of revolt, "I'll go to the mountain. I'll go back to my own folks." She had never really meant it before, but now, as she considered her case, no other course seemed open. She had never learned any trade that would have given her independence in a strange place, and she knew no one in the big towns of the valley where she might have hoped to find employment. Miss Hatchard was still away, but even had she been at North Dormer, she was the last person to whom Charity would have turned, since one of the motives urging her to flight was the wish not to see Lucius Harney. Travelling back from Nettleton in the crowded, brightly lit train, all exchange of confidence between them had been impossible, but during their drive from Hepburn to Creston River, she had gathered from Harney snatches of consolatory talk, again hampered by the freckled boy's presence, that he intended to see her the next day. At the moment she had found herself a vague comfort in the assurance, but in the desolate lucidity of the hours that followed, she had come to see the impossibility of meeting him again. Her dream of comradeship was over, and the scene on the wharf, vile and disgraceful as it had been, had, after all, shed the light of truth on her minute of madness. It was as if her guardian's words had stripped her bare in the face of the grinning crowd, and proclaimed to the world the secret admonitions of her conscience. She did not think these things out clearly. She simply followed the blind propulsion of her wretchedness. She did not want, ever again, to see anyone she had known. Above all, she did not want to see Harney. She climbed the hill path behind the house and struck through the woods by a short cut leading to the Creston road. A lead-coloured sky hung heavily over the fields, and in the forest the motionless air was stifling. But she pushed on, impatient to reach the road, which was the shortest way to the mountain. To do so, she had to follow the Creston road for a mile or two, and go within half a mile of the village, and she walked quickly, fearing to meet Harney, but there was no sign of him, and she had almost reached the branch road when she saw the flanks of a large white tent projecting through the trees by the roadside. She supposed that it sheltered a travelling circus which had come there for the 4th, but as she drew nearer she saw, over the folded back flap, a large sign bearing the inscription, "Gospel Tent." The interior seemed to be empty, but a young man in a black alpaca coat, his lank hair parted over a round white face, stepped from under the flap and advanced toward her with a smile. "Sister, your Saviour knows everything. Won't you come in and lay your guilt before him?" he asked insinuatingly, putting his hand on her arm. Charity started back and flushed. For a moment she thought the evangelist must have heard a report of the scene at Nettleton. Then she saw the absurdity of the supposition. "I only wished I had any to lay," she retorted, with one of her fierce flashes of self-derision, and the young man murmured, aghast, "Oh, sister, don't speak blasphemy!" But she had jerked her arm out of his hold, and was running up the branch road, trembling with the fear of meeting a familiar face. Presently she was out of sight of the village, and climbing into the heart of the forest. She could not hope to do the 15 miles to the mountain that afternoon. but she knew of a place half-way to Hamblin where she could sleep, and where no one would think of looking for her. It was a little deserted house